the alternatives. Remember, this is a simulation framework. So it's factoring in the alternatives that are profitable to invest in.
Profitable.
So the way, which, again, the alternatives would be put in, even under the LCP SIM framework, you wouldn't invest in an alternative that costs $20,000 an acre foot if it only relieves shortages that are worth $10,000 an acre foot. It would be better just to absorb the shortage. So in a way, the optimization assumption actually minimizes economic impacts. And this is one area where the SDB SIM and the LCP SIM have something in common. It's just because SDB SIM is a simulation model, the optimization is effectively done manually by hypothesizing different portfolios of water supplies.
I don't think there are any reporters here, Dr. Sunding. Would that mean that the proposed peripheral conveyance would be a profitable venture?
Well, you know, the answer right now, I'm going to sound like a two-handed economist, which is going to come in handy. I think the regulatory certainty components of BDCP have not come into focus yet. You know, here the losses are in the billions of dollars. And this is just for the ag sector, but it is for both CVP and state project combined. Well, here the numbers per acre foot are somewhat lower, which is to be expected, about 0.3 billion or 300 million in losses for every 1,000 acre feet of reduced, or 100,000 acre feet of reduced exports. So roughly present value of $3,000 per acre foot, or about $150 per acre foot on an annual basis. Does that seem like a high number or a low number to all of you? I think there are certainly instances I can point to where that's a very low number, in that farmers would have a much higher willingness to pay for water than that. But other instances I could point to where that would be probably about in the ballpark. Now, I don't mean any of this to sound too critical. I think the SWAP model is a significant academic achievement. I think a lot of work has gone into this over the years. There have been a few papers in the peer-reviewed literature based on SWRCB. I think there could be more, and I have some recommendations in that regard in a minute. So, take this in the spirit that I'm offering it. The SWRCB model, because it is such a detailed programming model, it's built on a huge number of assumptions. And so I think it's fair to say that the results that come out of the SWRCB model are really hypothetical. They're not tested against actual data, other than the calibration is done to try to mimic values for land and water that we happen to see out there in the real world. So the model's calibrated to give back results that look about like what the researcher expected. But beyond that, SWRCB is built on a huge number of assumptions that have important consequences to the results. I think there are a number of concerns about the validity of the underlying data, in particular an extensive reliance on UC crop production data or the crop budgets. I think there are general concerns in the economics profession about the type of calibration procedures that were used to fit the model to the data. It's an example of what we call positive mathematical programming, which is somewhere in between regular programming and econometrics. I think there's a real potential for, or a real reason to believe that the SWRCB model is based on some unrealistic assumptions about groundwater. In particular, I think over the long term, it makes overly optimistic assumptions about how much groundwater is available in certain parts of the San Joaquin Valley. And that, of course, has the effect of underestimating long-run impacts of changes in water availability. So with respect to SWRCB, I'd make a number of different recommendations. First, I really do think a lot of the research with SWRCB has been sponsored by the Department of Water Resources, but SWRCB is also used very commonly by the Bureau of Reclamation. I really do think it's time for an open, systematic peer review of the SWRCB model. And as an example of a process that worked well, I would point to AB 32 and some of the model development that happened around that. The early generation of models that were used to estimate the economic impacts of AB 32 were what we call computable general equilibrium models that are very similar in a lot of ways to the SWRCB model. There was a panel of academics from universities around California that was set up and functioned very, very effectively, looking at the ins and outs, daylighting the assumptions of the models that were used in AB 32, and then recommended construction of a whole new generation of models, as well as tweaks or fixes to the existing models. I think this problem is important enough, something like that would probably be warranted here. And fortunately, you've got some great resources just within the UC system, but also places like Stanford. I would also say it's time to develop an econometric model of the agricultural sector in the San Joaquin Valley. There's really, if you think about it, not much reason anymore to be using a hypothetical construct like SWRCB, even though it's useful, and I'm not recommending that it be abandoned at all. We do have a lot of data. There have been episodes where water supplies have gone up and down, employment's gone up and down, land allocation expands and shrinks. We can test using actual data what some of these relationships are. When water supplies in the past have been changed, what has actually happened? We don't need to do an entirely hypothetical analysis. And I should say there's a lot more remote sensing data available from satellite imaging, even going back quite a long period in time. Some of that could be brought to bear on this problem too. Once we had an econometric or a statistical model of how water availability has affected the ag sector, then we could actually test the predictions of SWRCB and some other models against historical behavior to see whether or not things square up or not. Even apart from that, I think it's very important to incorporate a more realistic treatment of groundwater in the SWRCB model. SWRCB, it does have groundwater as an input up to a certain defined amount, but it is not a groundwater model. and it is not linked with a groundwater model. I think that's something that would be very important to do. Dr. Perky talked earlier about some research that he's been doing with some people at Davis along these lines. I think that's promising, but there's certainly more that could be done in this regard. I think it's also important to reconfigure the regions in SWAP to better reflect actual variations in water rights, the state and federal project service area and groundwater conditions. Like LCP SIM, SWAP effectively divides the state up into regions that are based on DAUs defined by the Department of Water Resources. And then the assumption is that within each of those subregions in the valley, it's a free trade zone. And the problem with that is some regions in SWAP, I mean, one is effectively Westlands Water District. Okay, well, that's great. Farmers in Westlands trade with each other all the time, and there are a lot of integrated operations there, so that maybe you could live with. But there are other regions, say particularly on the southwestern side of the valley, that are a real mishmash of state, federal, groundwater, no groundwater, districts that have no record of ever having traded with each other ever, and not much economic relationships. Well, it doesn't seem reasonable to put those into one homogeneous region. So I think there is more that could be done to disaggregate SWAP. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
You caught me off guard. I thought you had a couple more pages there.
Oh, no. I only have 7 minutes left.
Any questions of this panel? Felicia, you've been awfully quiet all day.
I have, just because we've been so short on time. I figure I'll take it all in and then have to follow up as opposed to taking the time now. But just one thought in this, because you laid out a bunch of different concerns, things, ideas in this panel. Dr. Zane, I know that you are, maybe you're the only the only water economist I know, so I don't, who I've known for a long time, so I know you know the field, but presumably there's also a whole set of indicators or models or approaches that are in more nascent form, or maybe not, that deal with economic benefits of the ecosystem and for the fishermen. You know, if you were here presenting for Zeke, for example, you could explain how you would look at the cost of fishermen. Where should we look for that side of the equation?
Sure. Yeah, that's actually a great question, and I meant to say something about that up front. The models that I'm talking about are models that estimate economic impacts just to the ratepayers of the agencies. So on the ag side, it would be the farmers that are paying the bills there, and then on the urban side, businesses and single-family residential consumers and the like. And, you know, those are definitely legitimate places to look for impacts, but they aren't the only places in society that you would have impacts from changes in delta deliveries. And there are other models developed by other branches of economics that could be brought to bear. Commercial fishing impacts, I think, are relatively simple once one solves the hard biological problem of the change in stock. Once you have that, it's relatively straightforward to figure out, you know, what would be the change in commercial fishing profits or employment. And that's a legitimate thing to look at. Other types of impacts, you know, including some of the ones that we're looking at in BDCP, are what's the public valuation of restored wetlands or a restored ecosystem? Ecosystem services, we don't have to get into a detailed discussion of that, but I find it somewhat of an unhelpful concept from the perspective of environmental economics, in that I think there's a real potential to double count. But having said that, there are economic models that I think can pretty reliably estimate what are the public benefits of a restored ecosystem or restored habitat, things of that nature. So it's a good point. What I'm talking about here is just, you know, sort of one slice of the whole pie of economic impacts.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting you should have presented the whole. I just wanted to ask, because we're getting in this, and I know Brock has the enviable task of helping pull it together, but we sit and we get a lot of things all day long with people giving us a lot of models and a lot, that it was all very interesting, but all of it from a particular perspective, and then it's sort of up to us to separate the chaff from what we can do with it in the time frame that we have. So,
And if I could say too, the types of models that you're referring to, those are pretty commonly used now in different rulemaking processes. For
Right.
example, once through cooling, the federal government's undertaking a big effort to figure out what are the economic impacts of changes in entrainment and temperature fluctuations. Operations of Army Corps facilities or big hydroelectric projects.
Right.
FERC looks at these kinds of things pretty commonly, so you wouldn't be blazing a new trail. And there is, I think, a suite of models and a number of people in California and outside that could help with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
thanks.
There is one more, but you can come tomorrow. First thing tomorrow morning.